we added functionality called universal configuration. And let me share my screen. So we added functionality which we call universal configuration, and the big idea behind that was to give possibility to the developers who does not have Magento Cloud, but they have, for example, Magento on-prem, to give them possibility to install their Magento using Magento Cloud Docker box. The other big idea and the big challenge for us, which we're currently gonna work, is adding support for the Magento core development. And in the ideal case, we would like to have the core developers who are working on PWA, Magento core, MSI, and whatever, give them possibility to work with Magento Cloud Docker, because eventually this is currently the only one official dev box which Magento supports. So it would be good to have bigger collaboration from other developers and eventually have a bigger community around this project. One more thing is actually the challenge with the continuous integration pipeline. So internally, we are also switching to some processes around the Magento Cloud Docker, but in our ideal world, we would like to have some kind of continuous integration deployment for you guys, for some developers, to have possibility to use Cloud Docker in their processes to test Magento before actually going to the production. So I will describe how we are trying to achieve this. And today's format will be more, I think, demo oriented. I will actually show some code snippets. I will open my IDE to show some implementation details. So if you have any questions, please just let me know. I will be very glad to answer to those. As I said, this is very new functionality. We released it with latest Magento Cloud Docker release, which was 1.1.0. And I think we can begin. Thank you for joining. Okay, so as today we'll talk about the universal configuration, which we added in the latest release. So we added such thing as sources, and the sources represent the three different ways to pass build configuration to the Magento Cloud Docker. CLI source represents the options when you run the build compose command. I think you must be pretty well known how does this command work. So this is our old way of doing things. Magento Cloud source is a set of configuration files which are part of the Magento Cloud. As you remember, Magento Cloud works with a few files, which is .magento app YAML, .magento services YAML, and .magento roles YAML. So we call this Magento Cloud source, and the Magento Cloud Docker by default reads this file and builds your desired cloud DevBox environment according to this configuration. And the idea behind that is that we want to give possibility to have local environment as close as possible to your Magento Cloud environment. And the new one is universal configuration source. And the idea behind that is, okay, you do not have Magento Cloud. You probably have some kind of on-prem installation. You use Magento Commerce, and you want to use Cloud Docker. And the old trick was you would like to add some kind of Magento Cloud configuration files like Magento app YAML and so on to emulate the cloud, and then Magento Cloud Docker would read them and build desired DevBox. But it was kind of tricky, and we don't really like this approach. So we introduced a new file called .magento.docker.yaml, and I will show you the structure a bit later. But currently the sources is actually the set of these three sources, and they are in some way merged. And here is the priority of those three sources merged. So CLI source will always have the highest priority, and the idea is, for example, you have good configuration, it's looking good, but you would like to make small change, like enable email, or like you want to test some Magento new version. So instead of changing your file configuration, you can put the CLI option, and then your Docker Compose file will be rebuilt with a small option, but without changing your original configuration for the Cloud Docker. And Magento Cloud is a set of YAML configuration files, which are default for Magento Cloud. It has second priority, and if there was no CLI option, it will be used by default as the main source of truth. And the third by priority is universal configuration. And the idea is actually, if you do not have Magento Cloud configuration files, if you do not rewrite your option, your configuration with CLI option, it will be used as your main source of truth. We merge these three sources by this priority. And if you want to achieve the state where you do not have Magento Cloud files, you just use universal configuration, and everything will be work fine. In our latest release, we do not require your Magento Cloud Docker to have the Magento Cloud files. But you should be very careful here. Some things like a version of PHP cannot be resolved by default because there is some big variety of Magento versions we support. So if you do not have CLI option, if you do not have Magento Cloud, and if you do not have universal configuration file, during the build compose command, you will see the error that some of the options like PHP version or MySQL version cannot be resolved and the configuration cannot be built. So you should provide at least one of these possible source, so Magento Cloud Docker can know what kind of environment you want to be. So the use cases, as I said, are pretty different. We would like to cover bigger variety of developers, and as I said, we would like to go to the, I would say, on-prem market. We would like to have some support for the Magento on-prem developers. And this can be achieved by using universal configuration with CLI options. For existing Magento Cloud developers, nothing pretty much changes, as they still can use Magento Cloud configuration, but they are free to experiment with universal configuration, or if they have some side projects running with on-prem, they can use universal configuration there. And another big deal is CI/CD pipeline, which eventually is, I think, the most complicated one because you will have to pass some way to pass configurations, and like the biggest problem with CI/CD, you should explicitly say what kind of environment you want, because currently when you build in the Cloud Docker, we take a lot of guesses around what you want to give. Like we by default install varnish and so on, but in CI/CD pipeline you should explicitly say, okay, I want varnish, or okay, I don't want varnish. So CI/CD pipeline it's more advanced, and it requires more configuration settings to be passed to have the full control of the desired environment. So this is a rough example of the newly introduced universal configuration file. As I said, the name of this file is .magento.docker.yaml. So you will see this example soon on the dev docs. We are finalizing the latest fixes. But here you can see the big picture of this new file. And most of these things should be very familiar for you because, for example, the name of application came from the Magento Cloud configuration. And the idea behind that, we currently support multiple development environments, multiple dev boxes, but you should pass different names. And the biggest challenge with the Docker is once you spin up few copies of same, I would say, dev box, the resources that being consumed multiplies, and like we support it, but my 16 gigabytes MacBook Pro is kinda struggling sometimes. So, but we support this option here. And system is should be also familiar for you. So we support to most production developer. Here is an example with production mode. By default, we assume that mode is always production, so this is optional node. The services describe the services you would like to see on your environment. So here you can see the PHP, and there are a few things that I would like to point here. The version by default will never be resolved until you explicitly say in some way via CLI, via cloud config, or via universal configuration. So be sure to pass the correct version here. The enable disabled flag does not really matter here because if the service was added via universal configuration, we assume that this is enabled. But let's assume the case when you have some services being, for example, enabled by default. I would say you would like to experiment with some different services which can be enabled by default via DevBox, but you want to disable it. I think one of the good examples is Varnish. I think currently we enable it by default, but if you would like to disable it, there is enabled option where you can disable the Varnish. So for PHP, the matter is extensions. So the way how we install extensions for PHP on the Cloud Docker is we install all of, I think, possible, applicable, make sense set of extensions, and then we disable them. So you will have to just option to enable and disable those extensions. Here is example for, I think, Magento 2.3.5. And the only extension that I had to enable was XSL, JSON, and Redis. On previous Magento, there was encrypt, but in 2.3.5, there is no need encrypt because it was removed from PHP 7.3. For MySQL, we kind of evolved as well. And here is an interesting thing. So we have an option called image. And the idea behind that is eventually we support not only MariaDB, but in latest version we support also MySQL. And also image is very useful if you would like to test on your fork images, or you build an image locally and you would like to provide this image that you built locally. This is pretty interesting thing, but I would like really to just give some head ups on this. The version here is actually the target version of MariaDB, so there is actually nothing very different. For Redis as well, we currently support only the Redis official image, but in case you would like to use something external or you would like to use some local images, you are free to do this. And the Elasticsearch is pretty the same. So the next one interesting thing is hooks. So we support hooks in this pretty same way as we support them with magento.app.yaml file. So if you would like to configure your hooks in different way, you can do this here. Or if you have some scenarios you would like to merge, you can always do this here because this is the main place to configure the hooks. And the last one I think is mounts. So the mounts describe the volumes which will be mounted on your Docker. And this idea still came from the Magento Cloud, where you always have a redundant file system and you have 4 mounted. We didn't change this approach, but we assume that will be changed sooner or later once more core developers will be on board with the solution and they will have a little bit different demands. And so I think look deeply in the mounts, maybe remove some of them, maybe add some of them, but eventually this is the currently only one recommended way to install Magento correctly, to have a redundant file system and to have 4 writable directories. Yeah. Yes. Another interesting thing is, as I said, currently we merging different sources, and actually we are trying to build some target configurations that will be applied and the box environment will be built. But let's assume the case when you have continuous integration pipeline and there is no human interaction happening. There is only automated scripts, and for this we added a new command called build custom. And build custom explicitly accepts only one argument, which is a JSON string. And this JSON string represents a universal configuration. It's pretty similar to the YAML, and like it's supposed to be very similar to YAML, but in JSON form. And the idea here is that you have some kind of pipeline, you have Jenkins or whatever, and then you just send the request to build some target environment. You send the JSON payload, and Cloud Docker will build you this environment. So we are currently testing this internally. You always will be welcome to, if you have any suggestion, feedback on this. But the idea is pretty simple. You have automated scripts, you send JSON payload, and the Magento will build you the environment you requested. So I will just show a small code that how we choose this, how does the merging happen, and we can discuss it. I will open my IDE with Magento Cloud Docker installed. You always can find this code on the public GitHub repository if you have any comments and you have pull requests. This is the main entry point for the Cloud Docker, the command which called build compose. Compose is the most essential thing because it's actually accepts multiple options, it reads configuration, and then it builds the Docker Compose configuration. So what we did, we extended the build compose to be a bit more complicated. So we created the configuration factory which accepts a bunch of sources. And here I will give a small overview over all of the sources. So the base source is something that we came up as very default settings. And by very default settings, we would like to say that, okay, our default host and our default port for most of installation is Magento to Docker and port 80. Of course, you can change it later, but we need just this base host to make sure that you don't need to pass these parameters in some way, because actually that will need some more action, but this is something that we assumed that is default settings for most of the environment. So the interesting thing is by default we do not enable Chrome, Previously, we had always cron enabled, but our most recent experiments show that having cron enabled by default has pretty tremendous performance degradation and load on the local machine. So we currently disable it by default. If you would like to enable it, you can do it via the CLI or via any of the configuration files. System port, system host, as Magento Docker and port 80. Magento 2 version is something that we will do it for you. And the system mode is production. So of course you can change it later. The second is cloud-based source. And cloud-based source is already more interesting because cloud-based source is something that you would like to see on cloud because it's how it's built. But locally, you in most cases don't see it because we build it by default. And the good example is by default we are adding TLS, which is needed for Docker because in Docker there is no good way to use HTTPS port 443, so we use TLS service to have this. And of course we have the Nginx. So on cloud we do not specifically say that you need Nginx, but of course you need this. So cloud-based source makes sure that by default you have a working environment without specifying some services which in real world on cloud you would not specify. So we have Nginx, TLS, and the varch. And the generic is something that we just use for technical purposes in the cloud Docker Docker Compose file because we store there some variables. And here also the interesting thing that by default we add some variables which you don't also need to customize because in most cases it will be enough. So we use PHP memory, upload max file size, Magento root, and this is a configuration needed by default for XDevelop computer to be working properly. The next one is already cloud source, and the cloud source is a reader and resolver for the Magento Cloud configuration files. So it resolves the type, it resolves the relationship with another services, and resolves the name. So it actually takes the Magento app YAML, it combines it with the Magento services YAML, and then figure out what should be the result of these files. So there is a pretty interesting resolving mechanism around this, but I don't really know if it will make much sense to go through them. So you're okay to look at this code and then figure out, but eventually the idea behind this cloud source is we read those files and then we extract them into something readable. And by readable, I mean that all of these configurations, they being converted into the universal configuration file representation. So I will just show how we do this. So we use the repository and we set configuration files and the final representation will be something like this. So this is a Laravel representation of array access, where is different parts have been separated by the dot. So you can assume this is something like system and sync engine. So we use the Laravel to build some kind of universal representation from different configuration, and then to have very easy access to those configuration. So we take the cloud sources and then we fill the repository with our values. It may look pretty difficult, but eventually it's very simple. So we actually fill just array access object. The next one is the config source, and the config source is eventually the universal configuration file, which is .magento.docker YAML. And it's one of the simplest resolver, because what it do is just read the file, it sees in YAML, and then it converts to the array, and then passes to the universal configuration representation. So it's very simple. So the universal configuration is what we trying to build from all of the sources, and to have it in some way of unified way, so we can then access to this array and read the values. And what is interesting here is actually we do not distinguish any difference between these sources. We just convert those sources to the standard universal representation, and then we merge them. The last one is CLI source, and CLI source is something that you would like to put as options to the build compose command. So it's kind of big class. Maybe we would like to refactor it, but eventually just goes through all possible options that we have, and then it puts them into the universal representation. So it goes through the Selenium options, goes through the database options, and then it just sets them into the universal representation. It's pretty simple. It's just big, large file, because like it's pretty difficult to have one solution for all of the different options. Like some options are very complicated. They can be pretty nasty itself, so it's kind of big file. But it's very simple. It just takes the options from the CLI and then converts them into the universal representation. And actually that's all. So we resolve this for sources, and then we actually just put them into the one repository, one universal representation using array replace recursive. So it makes sense here, because you can see that CLI source is last one, which says that actually it will be merged last, and it will have the top priority. Yeah, like this. So here is actually nothing really special. We generate some files like the default config.php, so you can later edit them. We call this generator. And another command which is interesting called build custom compose. As I said, this is new command which we added in the latest release. And the idea here is this command accepts only one JSON string, which then will be used as universal configuration. And here you can see that this set is very small. It has only base, cloud-based source, and the custom source. So you won't see any options here. You won't see any Magento app YAML configuration source here, because the idea we're trying to build very clean, very well controlled configuration, and we assume that everything that you need to build for the box you will pass via JSON payload string. So even if you have universal configuration, or even if you have Magento Cloud configuration, we won't read those files. We will only favor those what you passed here. This is, I think, pretty all for the code resolvers. So as I said, we have a bunch of sources. We trying to combine and resolve them and build the correct universal configuration file. What else is that our build compose was dramatically increased. So since we are trying to give you more control over the desired environment, we add in more options. And the latest release, you can see new options like I think the images. So you can pass a different image, for example, for database. So you can specify if you don't want to use MariaDB, you can use MySQL, or you can use your own fork. So we are extending these options. And actually documentation for those options will be also extended, so you can always find it on DevDocs. I think this is mostly all what I wanted to show today. The bigger, I think, demo about all of the features which they released in the latest version of Cloud Docker will be, I think, in next 4 weeks. But this is something that I really wanted to cover, and I really want to have some feedback. And yeah, that's all from my side. Thank you for your attention. Any questions so far? Well, yeah, okay. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach us in Cloud Docker Slack channel on behalf of Magento Cloud Docker and the cloud itself. Yeah, thank you. Have a great day. Our recording will be available probably today on YouTube, so you can also post comment there. Thank you. Have a great day. Bye.